Hello, everyone. Welcome to the temporal graph reading group for today, and this will also be the last temporal graph reading group of the year. So we are very glad to host Ke-Jia Chen from Nanjing University of Posts and Telecommunications today. So before we dive into the talk, I just want to say thank you to everyone who've been to our talks, and it has been a great year of different temporal graph learning talks, and we are very excited to have so many diverse speakers joining us at the reading group. So now for the now for the speaker introduction for today. Ke-Jia Chen is an associate professor in Nanjing University of Post and Telecommunications, China, and she received her PhD in University de Technologie de Compiègne, France, and her master's and bachelor degree in Nanjing University, China. Her current research focuses on graph machine learning and complex network analysis. And she has published papers in TOIS, TKDD, ECML, ICDM, ASO and AM, and so on. So we are very excited to have her here presenting her TKDD paper, Self-Supervised Dynamic Graph Representation Learning via Temporal Subgraph contrast today. And I'll hand the mic to you, Ke-Jia.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ke-Jia Chen from NGUPT in Nanjing, China. And it's a great opportunity to be invited to this forum to share with you our research work on temporal graphs. And in fact, the concept of graph machine learning has been widely recognized, and the self-supervised learning on graphs has recently drawn a lot of attention. And current studies on this topic mainly use static information such as graph structures, but seldom can well capture the dynamic information such as timestamps of the edges. So in this work, we propose a self-supervised dynamic graph representation learning framework, which defines a temporal subgraph contrastive learning task to learn the structural features as well as the evolutional features of a dynamic graph. So this is the content. First, the introduction. In real world, there exists a lot of graph structured data such as social network, collaboration network, and hyperlink graphs. They can naturally represent the entities and their relationships. Moreover, those graphs are usually dynamic since relationships are changing with time. And in recent years, learning from graphs becomes a very popular research area. The node in the graph can be represented as a low-dimensional embedding that preserves its attributive and structural features. Many popular GNN models are supervised or semi-supervised, which means that they heavily rely on labels, and the labels usually need high acquisition cost, so that could also lead to weak robustness. For example, if there are some label-related adversarial attacks, the GNN model will be very fragile. So we all know that self-supervised learning can effectively alleviate these problems. So self-supervised learning on graphs has recently drawn a lot of attention. It focuses on learning representations from the structural perspective by contrasting graph elements of different scales, such as node and local subgraph contrasting or node and global graph contrasting. However, existing graph contrastive learning methods do not consider the dynamics of the graphs. For example, the temporal information is not well used in the pretext task or in the objective function. So the learned node representation cannot reflect the graph evolution. So that is why our work attempts to bridge this gap. Okay. So let me take the social network as an example. Here, the edge represents the friend relationship of two-person nodes, and each edge is marked with a time step. Yes, from T1 to T9, and indicating the moment when they became friends. And here the central node is Mary. She used to be an engineer, and most of her neighbors are engineer too before the time T6. Yes, and recently, Mary changed her career to become a teacher and started to have teacher neighbor nodes. For example, he will friend a teacher at a time T9. So for the static graph learning model, samples the subgraphs and encodes the nodes only based on structures. So it could predict that Mary will friend an engineer instead of a teacher at time T9. Instead, if we use the temporal information, the dynamic subgraph sampling and node representation method can capture Mary's relationship evolution, which may give a more accurate prediction. So that is the motivation of our work. We aim to study dynamic graph contrastive learning to better capture the structural evolution characteristics of graphs by introducing temporal information. And instinctively, frequent changes of neighbors will reflect potential change of the central node. And the latest neighbors that interacted with the central node are more valuable in node representation. So as a result, we first propose a temporal subgraph sampling method, which uses both the structural and temporal information of the neighborhoods. And then we define a new readout function to get the summary of temporal subgraph. And finally, we define a temporal subgraph contrast loss, including the structure contrast loss and the time contrast loss. The method is named die sub C, and here is the overview of the die sub C framework, which mainly include 3 time enhanced modulars. You see, the first modular is a temporal subgraph sampling. For each node, a temporal subgraph in the original graph is sampled to get a time-weighted subgraph GI. Okay, and an unweighted subgraph GI prime. Let's see that. Okay. And the second modular is a node and subgraph representation. The GI and GI prime are encoded through GNN, and then the summary of each subgraph is represented by a readout function respectively. And for each node I, we have its representation HI, okay, HI, a time-weighted subgraph representation SI, and an unweighted subgraph representation SI prime. Okay, and the third modular is temporal contrastive learning. And for each central node I, we construct a positive sample SI, a temporal negative sample SI prime, and a structural negative sample SI wave. And the model is trained by maximizing the mutual information of the central node representation and the time-weighted subgraph representation. Okay. So here you
just a quick question.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the previous slide? So basically you are using the unweighted subgraph. So the subgraph that removing the time information as the negative sample, right?
Yes.
So
For the
yeah. Yeah, so my question is basically what happens if you have a temporal subgraph that happens that all the edges have the same time, like the same timestamp, then it is basically equivalent to your unweighted subgraph.
you mean the unweighted subgraph GI prime, right?
Yeah,
For the GI prime, we do not use a timestamp of the graph. It's basically
right,
like a static graph.
right.
So
So for the time-weighted subgraph, here, if in this example, all the time T1, T2, T3, T4 are the same time. So if they are equal to each other, then this is exactly the same as the unweighted subgraph, right?
yes, yes, right. You mean that all the time steps are the same, right?
Yes,
Yes, if all the timestamps are the same timestamp, it is equivalent to a static graph in our context.
right. So then you cannot use it as a positive example because it will be the same as negative example in that case.
Yes, for the positive sample, actually we have two negative sample. The negative sample, two negative sample are the temporal negative sample and the structural negative sample. And for the positive sample is time-weighted subgraph. So if and the time-weighted subgraph is actually use the temporal information of the dynamic graph.
Right. Okay, so one of the negative sample will be different. Okay. Thanks.
Yes, and usually they are different, GI and GI prime.
Right. Thanks.
Okay, so I continue. As I said, there are three modulars, so I will detail each of them. And for the step one is the temporal subgraph sampling, and we hope the sampler consider both the structure of neighbors and the timestamp of the edge interactions. So here is a sampling rule. Firstly, all first order neighbors of I are sampled. And since the number of the first order neighbors is usually less than k, the second order or even the high order neighbors of I may be sampled until the number of the candidate nodes is greater than or equal to k. And secondly, if the number of the candidate nodes is greater than k, a selection strategy is adopted to select more important candidate nodes into the sampling pool according to their importance score. So here the importance score is defined as a combination of a structure importance score, SJ structure, and temporal importance score, SJ time. And where here the J is a node ID in the sampling path. And the structure and the structural importance score is defined as a degree of the node, but it can also be defined using other metrics such as eigenvector centricity or page rank value and so on. And I will discuss that in the experiment section. Okay. Another important score is a temporal importance score. It is a normalized latest timestamp of the edge connected to node J. And finally, the time-weighted subgraph GI and unweighted subgraph GI prime of node I are obtained. And we can get the feature matrix and the adjacency matrix of each subgraph. And both of them will be used in the subsequent contrastive learning task. Okay, so here is an example, and it's just shown in the left figure, where here the T represents the timestamp, and S represents the importance score. So assuming that the K is 10, and for the yellow central node, its four first order neighbors are first sampled, and then its 11 second order neighbors are also sampled, increasing to 16 nodes in the candidate set. Now, according to the importance score, the 5 blue nodes with the highest importance score will be saved as a sampled nodes. Okay. So before the temporal contrastive learning modular, we need to present the node and the sampled subgraph.
Before we move on, can I ask a quick question?
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out if this embedding is a function of time. So do we have a timestamp? So on the previous slide there, yeah. Do we have a timestamp associated with this evaluation for the yellow node? So that, for example, we only sample edges that occurred before that timestamp to prevent like a future information leak? Or is this like a embedding at the end of the window that incorporates all of the time?
Actually, we did not get the embedding of the nodes at this time. We just get the temporal subgraph to accomplish the constructive learning later. And the embedding is when we sample the temporal subgraph, and we will send them to a GNN and to encode each node of in the subgraph and get the summary of the subgraph.
Okay, but ignoring the embedding piece, just this temporal subgraph, is it with reference to a particular timestamp so that we're only sampling edges that occur before that? Or are you sampling the edges regardless of timestamp?
As I said, that we sample the subgraph according to several
yeah, so T max there. Is that can that go into the future relative to TJ?
Sorry.
So you have TJ, right? That's the time of what? The central node? Is that right? TJ?
TJ. Okay. Actually, the TJ is not the time stamp connecting to the central node. It is it is a node node J in the sampling path, and let me see. TJ. Oh, you mean TJ, right?
Mm-hmm.
TJ is yes, it is the latest timestamp of the edge connected to the node J, and the node J is in the sampling path for the central node I.
So there's no reference to a timestamp on TI. Is that right? Is the timestamps are only on the edges, not
Yes.
on the nodes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. So then in the next step, let me see. In the next step is we need to represent the node and the sampled subgraphs. So here, the encoder E1 and epsilon 1 and 2 are used to output the representation HI and HI prime for GI and GI prime, respectively. So both E1 and E2 adopt a one-layer GCN to aggregate the neighbor information. And this is the propagation rule in the equation 6. And the representation HI of the central node I is then picked out from the representation matrix. And then we use two readout functions to get the time-weighted subgraph representation SI, and the unweighted subgraph representation SI prime. And specifically, the readout function R1 is a time-aware readout function, so which calculates the influence score of any node J on the central node I, and then perform a weighted average of node representations to get SI. And here, tau ij represents the latest interaction timestamp between I and J. And the distance ij represents the shortest distance between I and J, and the beta is a hyperparameter. And R2 is used to simply average all the node representation in the subgraph GI prime. And in the last module is temporal contrastive learning. And we know that the pretext task and the generation of positive and negative samples are crucial for self-supervised learning. And as mentioned above, the dynamics of neighborhood nodes has greater influence on the central node than that of distant nodes. So the pretext task is designed to make the central nodes strongly correlated to its regional neighbors. And in our method, the mutual information of the central node and its corresponding temporal subgraph is maximized. And for the central node I, the pretext task is to contrast its real temporal subgraph to its fake temporal subgraph. Okay. Specifically for HI, a positive sample, a structural negative sample, and a temporal negative sample are constructed. The positive sample is a time-weighted subgraph representation, SI. The structural negative sample is generated by shuffling the representation set of time-weighted subgraphs, and the temporal negative sample is unweighted subgraph representation, SI prime. So the purpose is to make the node representation HI is closer to the time-weighted subgraph representation SI and farther away from the unweighted subgraph representation SI prime. In this way, the temporal contrast information is therefore emphasized. And finally, the margin triplet loss is used to train the model as it is more favorable for the subgraph contrastive learning. And the margin loss of the structural negative sample is defined in the equation 12. And here rho is a sigmoid function, and phi is the margin value. And similarly, we have the margin loss of the temporal negative sample, which are defined in equation 13. So that is sorry. And as a result, the total loss of the model is it is in this equation is a total loss function, and here lambda is a hyperparameter to balance to loss. So experiment. In the experiments, we compare the performance of our method, die sub C, and the related baseline methods on two tasks, link prediction and node classification. And we also conduct ablation study to evaluate each proposed time enhanced modular to find how it affects the overall model. And in the temporal subgraph sampling modular, we study the impact of different structural importance metrics, the subgraph size of the model, and we analyze the sensitivity of the model to several hyperparameters. And finally, we present the visualization of the node representation obtained by die sub C and subcon for comparison. So for a comprehensive comparison, we use 5 widely used data sets, and they are collected from different types of real networks. For comparison, we use 3 types of baseline methods. The first type are continuous time dynamic graph representation learning methods, such as TGN and DIREP, CTDNE, and HTNE. They are all continuous time dynamic graph representation learning methods. And the second type of baselines are some state-of-art static graph self-supervised learning methods, such as DGI and subcon and GCA. And The third type of baselines are static graph representation learning benchmarks, like Notewek and GraphSage. Okay, so note that when we reproduce the codes of different models, we select the reported optimal hyperparameters to ensure a fair comparison. And the comparative results of all methods in link prediction performance are summarized in this table. And overall, you can see that our model shows competitive performance, and except on the mass overflow dataset, the AUC and the accuracy of DICEP-C is slightly lower than that of TGN, and but the rest performance, the model is superior to all baselines on the remaining data sets. And moreover, the methods that use self-supervised learning, such as DGI, subcon, and they perform better than the methods that do not use self-supervised learning. Okay. And the DICEP-C performs for the node classification, it performs in the second or third place, not the first place, but performs quite well. The main reason, because I think maybe the temporal information is useful for the dynamic task like link prediction, because it's also a task. It's a dynamic task, right? But for the node classification, the labels are static. So maybe the temporal information may not provide more information for this task. So that is why DICEP-C performs not the first place in this task. So in order to further observe the impact of 3-time enhanced modular, that is the temporal subgraph sampling, time-weighted subgraph representation, and the temporal contrastive learning of DICEP-C, we conduct a series of ablation experiments by replacing each of the 3 modular with the counterpart that does not use the time information. And here the subscript -s represents that the model replaces the temporal subgraph sampling with subgraph sampling that only use structural information. And -n means that the model does not use the negative sample, for contrastive learning. And -r stands for replacing the readout function with a simple average function in time-weighted subgraph representation. The results verify the effectiveness of each time-enhanced modular, which consistently improves the model performance on all data sets, especially when considering the negative sample Si prime. The performance of the model is significantly improved, and you can see the comparative result of DICEP-C -R and -N and R. Okay, so and the combination of 3 modular achieves the best performance, of course. Okay, and we also compare the performance of the model using different structural importance metrics, because it is important to evaluate the influence score of each neighbor, right? So the structural importance metrics, we compare 3 kinds of structural metrics. They are degrees and eigenvector, centrality, and page rank values. And we find that even though the degree is simple, right, but it has the best performance as a structural importance matrix. So that is why we use the degree to as the structural importance metric. And we also study the impact of the subgraph size in DICEP-C on the 5 data sets. We adjusted the subgraph size from 10 to 100, including the central node. And the results show that the model achieves better when the size of the subgraph is larger. Okay, it is probably because the more neighborhood nodes contain more structural and temporal information. However, in the forum dataset, the model with the subgraph 100 performs a little bit worse than the model with the subgraph size 50. It may be because the dataset is actually small in size. So a large size subgraph will contain the nodes far away from the central node. So sometimes the size of the subgraph depends on the dataset.
And yeah, thanks for the nice application study here. So just a quick question. Do you think the reason why the subgraph size, so we can see that basically around 20, basically for all data sets, you have a very significant boost, right? So if you consider computational complexity and you want to have the best trade-off for efficiency, it seems to like picking something around 20 or 40 is the best choice. So do you think that's because at 20, it would basically include more than the one hop neighborhood because most nodes don't have that many direct neighbors. And if you only have 5 or 10, then most nodes are only looking at their local neighborhood instead of 2 hop. So maybe that's why the sudden jump, but I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think you're right. Yes, when the size of the subgraph is too small, such as 5 or 10, the performance you can see is poor because it contains a few neighborhood and the structure information, temporal information not sufficient. But when the subgraph size is 20, the model performs quite well on 5 datasets and also it consumes less system memory than the subgraph with 40 or 50. So
right.
So I think that's why we set the size as 20 because
right. That makes sense.
It can also get the good performance. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. So, and then we also analyze the value of lambda, and the parameter lambda is to balance the relationship between the structure and the time negative samples. So overall, we find that the model performs best when the lambda is 0.5. Okay, so yes. And the hyperparameters alpha and beta determine the quality of temporal subgraph sampling and the time-weighted subgraph representation. And here alpha is used to balance the structural and temporal information in the subgraph sampling. And the beta is used to balance the influence of the latest interaction and its distance to the central node. So the stability of the model under the perturbation of the two parameters is observed, And the result on the forum and the Bitcoin alpha datasets are shown here. And on the forum dataset, the model performed best when alpha is 10 and beta is 1.6. And on the Bitcoin alpha dataset, the model performed best when alpha is 10 and the beta is 1.2. So both of that are around the median of their respective value ranges on different datasets. However, it can be seen that the DICEP-C is sensitive to these two hyperparameters. And as we mentioned before, the result shows that the temporal information is at least as important as structural information when sampling. Okay. And finally, we use the TSNE algorithm to visualize node representation and the latest interactions obtained by DICEP-C and DICEP-COM. And the figure shows the result on the Bitcoin alpha dataset. Here, the red lines denote the latest 10 interactions. Okay, it's a timestamp, the latest 10 interactions. The visualization result show that under the DICEP-C, the latest interacted nodes are closer. Okay. Yes, they are closer in the embedding space compared to subcon, which is a static subgraph contrastive learning method. And moreover, we can observe that the nodes that are recently active are more clustered in the visualization of DICEP-C and than that of subcon. So it is consistent with the characteristics of this data set, because the users who trust each other are often in a community structure, so they are supposed to be closer in the embedding space. Okay, the conclusion, and in our work, we actually propose a new self-supervised dynamic graph representation learning framework, and based on the temporal subgraph contrast. And the model proposes 3 time enhanced modulars, which can not only sample more effective subgraphs, but also can learn better representation by the temporal contrast loss. And we hope that the model can give insight for the future study on continuous time graph representation learning. And yes, and that's all. Thank you. And more questions?
Yes, thanks so much for your presentation. I forgot to mention at the beginning of the talk, but I just want to mention that our speaker today, Ke-Jia, is actually at a time zone where it's past midnight at her local time zone. So thanks so much for giving a talk late and yeah, and sharing the very interesting paper with us. Yeah,
Thank you.
So I think the work is very interesting. Can you go back a few slides on some of the data sets? On some of data sets, yeah. So if you go back to the main results one that you were showing, yeah, the link prediction. So do you know what's happening with the math overflow? Like the performance of your model is close with TGN. But and then how do you calculate the accuracy? So are you doing binary classification for the links?
Yes. You mean that in the data set, mass overflow that
Right.
we, okay. Yes, for the TGN, yes, actually we can see that TGN performs very well in many data sets. But for the math,
So I guess
actually, I don't
Yeah.
remember quite well about this
okay.
data set, but
Yeah.
maybe I explain that in the paper. I'm not sure.
But so my main question is actually like, have you tried basically adding the temporal contractive learning to other models? Because I believe your model currently is just based on mostly using GCN layers, right? With the pre-training of the contrastive learning.
Yes, we only use one layer GCN to do this work, but I think actually each modular can be improved. For
Right.
example, for the subgraph sampling and the encoding part, they can be improved by using more reasonable or more efficient model because we already have many other advanced GNN model, right, to do the encoding. Yes, but actually I did not continue this topic. Recently, I changed to do some other research topics such as graph matching. So
I see.
yeah, so I did not discuss it in recently to how to improve this model, but I think that will be possible to improve it.
Okay, sounds good. So I just thought that the contrastive learning can actually be applied to many other models like TGN, so it might improve their performance further. So that's what I
Yes.
suspect, but I'm not sure if that, yeah, but yeah, most likely, yeah. Is there any other questions from the audience? Okay, so if there's no more question from the audience, let's thank the speaker for the talk again. Yeah, and thanks so much for giving details on your paper, and it's definitely one of the first paper to do constructive learning in dynamic graphs. And I just want to mention that for those who want to meet at NeurIPS, we also have the temporal graph learning workshop at NeurIPS. So if you plan to be there in person, so that would be great to see you in person. The workshop will also be hosted online. So if you have a NeurIPS registration, I believe you can also stream the talks online as well. Yeah, so I will see you all like next year for the talk. And let's thank the speaker again.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a nice holiday season.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.